On this Tuesday night, Ukraine's president challenges the UN. Volodymyr Zelenskyy asks, what's the point of the UN if it won't hold Russia accountable?
Are you ready to close the UN? If your answer is no, then you need to act immediately.
More graphic evidence of civilians killed in Bucha and the chilling Russian plan to erase Ukraine as a country. Pandemic protection, the new guidance on a second booster shot, and the province's extending mask mandates. Climate goals. Can Canada's energy sector ramp up production while cutting emissions? Plus, an evolving story.
There have been tears.
The mysterious disappearance and return of Charles Darwin's manuscripts.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Ukraine's president gave some blistering and blunt advice to the United Nations Security Council today. In a virtual address, Volodymyr Zelenskyy essentially asked, what is the point of the UN? What security is it guaranteeing if it doesn't act to stop Vladimir Putin? Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That gives it veto power over decisions. Zelenskyy says Russia has turned that veto power into a license to kill.
You can do two things. Either remove Russia as an aggressor and a source of war, so it cannot block decisions about its own aggression, its own war. Or if there is no alternative and no option, then the next option would be dissolve yourself altogether.
The horror of what happened in Bucha, he says, is not the only atrocity. He says there are others the world has yet to see. He ended his briefing to the UN with an extremely graphic video showing burned corpses and mass graves. There is no way to tell this story unless we show some of those images or risk sanitizing what's really happening. Our coverage begins with Crystal Goomansingh.
Ukraine needs peace, Europe needs peace, and the world needs peace.
At the urging of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the UN Security Council sat silently, confronted by video proof of the horrors of Russia's war on Ukraine. The images are difficult to look at. Some we have blurred for broadcast. Bodies of Ukrainian civilians dead in the streets and mass graves. They are awful images of war. Ukraine's leaders forcing the world to face this grim reality and demanding accountability from council members against Russia.
The massacre in our city of Bucha is only one, unfortunately, only one of many examples of what the occupiers have been doing on our land for the past 41 days.
Independent groups are currently working to determine if the atrocities constitute war crimes, such as confirmed strikes on 85 health facilities and worker sites. Investigations are also underway for the use of cluster munitions, as well as the treatment of prisoners of war. Zelenskyy has shared accounts of Russian soldiers raping, looting, and killing indiscriminately. Clearly frustrated, he told the UN Tuesday that if it can't ensure peace and security, its Security Council should consider dissolving. One nation called on the Council to reassure the world of its relevance. Russia's representative lashed out at the notion the Federation is violating international law, again claiming the images from Bucha are fake and accusing Ukrainian nationals of killing civilians.
Every lie we hear from the Russian representative is more evidence that they do not belong on the Human Rights Council.
The call by the U.S. to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council comes as NATO anticipates more intense fighting in the south and east of Ukraine. Canada, too, says that Russia should be suspended from the UN Human Rights Council. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly writing on social media, Russia's utter disregard for human rights could not be any clearer. Russia has no place on the UNHRC. Donna?
All right, Crystal Goomansingh in London, thank you. The brutality of what Russia is doing in Ukraine is not random acts of violence. It is part of a plan. Vladimir Putin has said multiple times Ukraine is not a real country, that it belongs to Russia. This week, a state-run news agency published an op-ed spelling it out further. In justifying the war, or special operation as it's called in Russia, the author claims Ukrainianism is a greater threat to the world than Hitler's Nazi Party, and claims because a significant part of the masses are passive Nazis and accomplices of Nazism, then Russia's punishment of civilians is justified. It also says Ukraine's elite must be eliminated, as re-education is impossible. A reminder, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is Jewish, and he's a descendant of Holocaust survivors. That theme of denazifying, unfounded by any facts, is repeated in a letter written by Dmitry Medvedev. He's a former president of Russia. He also calls for the cultural genocide of Ukraine. These complex tasks do not happen all at once, Medvedev writes, and they will be decided not only on the battlefields. He ends with this chilling line: the goal is for the sake of the peace of future generations of Ukrainians and the opportunity to finally build an open Eurasia from Lisbon to Vladivostok. At the same time, the Kremlin, which completely controls the media in Russia, is ramping up denials any civilians have been killed, part of its propaganda strategy to confuse, deflect, and hide the truth. Redmond Shannon on the evidence in Bucha and the response from the West, and another warning: some of the images are disturbing.
With bodies now removed from the streets of Bucha, video from Ukraine's State Emergency Service shows workers removing unexploded shells. But authorities expect to discover many more bodies in Kyiv's suburbs in the coming days. I don't know exactly what happened to that house, says this man in a nearby town, but there are people under the rubble there. Russia claims the deaths in Bucha were staged after Russian troops left at the end of March, despite the mounting evidence. These satellite images show bodies on a Bucha street almost 2 weeks earlier. An analysis by the New York Times shows they were lying in the same positions when the Russian troops left. And this drone video appears to show the moment a cyclist was gunned down. The video matching the same position where a body and a bike were later found. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson attempted to break through Russia's propaganda machine with his own bilingual message condemning Vladimir Putin.
He knows that these crimes betray the trust of every Russian mother.
The horrors of Bucha triggering what is now a fifth round of sanctions from the European Union.
Clearly, in view of events, we need to increase our pressure further. We will impose an import ban on coal from Russia, worth €4 billion per year.
The EU also sanctioning Russian shipping, plus exports of wood, seafood and liquor, but not Russian oil or gas. Europe simply too reliant on those imports for now. Reports from the Czech Republic say its government is now the first to send tanks to Ukraine.
We currently are in need of heavy weapons like planes, tanks, armored personnel, vehicles.
Ukraine again warning that Russia's retreat from Kyiv is only intended to redouble the force of its invasion in the east. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Western humanitarian aid continues to be turned away from the besieged city of Mariupol, where tens of thousands of residents are trapped. This drone footage shows long lineups today outside a former shopping center. It's believed people are getting aid from Russian forces. The Red Cross says its team attempting to bring supplies in and get people out was turned away after being held by police near the port city. The aid agency says it's been working to reach Mariupol since last week without success. Ukraine says thousands of residents there have been forcibly deported to Russia. The war in Ukraine has put Canada's military spending in the spotlight. The next federal budget will be delivered on Thursday. With Russia's aggression, there is pressure on all Western countries to hike defense spending and keep their commitments to NORAD and NATO. Abigail Beeman on what Canadians can expect.
A bigger defense budget is needed now.
Not a new call, but Canada's lagging military spending and outdated equipment is now center stage in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Add in pressure from allies to hit the 2% of GDP NATO defense spending target. Canada is currently at 1.4%.
What is your number?
and pressure from successive U.S. administrations. Ottawa has been signaling more spending is coming in Thursday's budget.
With NORAD modernization on the table, with increased investments in defense, the Arctic is an area we're going to look closely at.
New Democrats support some investments, but
we do not believe that the 2% that NATO is recommending is appropriate for Canada. We don't think it would be achievable.
While Conservatives want Liberals to meet that target, and more action on the F-35 fighter jet deal.
Our defense is woefully understaffed and underfunded and under-equipped.
Some analysts believe we could see billions of dollars in increased military spending Thursday. In terms of what could be included, specifics on NORAD modernization is high on the list.
It's definitely a weakness, certainly with climate change and sort of the opening up the Arctic towards being more accessible both by Russia, to a lesser degree China.
In addition, post-Afghanistan retirements, stretched staff helping in the pandemic and climate change disasters, plus military misconduct scandals have meant a drain on experienced staff with institutional knowledge difficult to replace.
All the stuff that's been going on for the past year and a half that we've been talking about, that affects recruitment and retention.
And while no one expects a quick fix Thursday, there's also the problem of a broken procurement system.
Incredibly cumbersome, split between 3 departments, multiple central agencies, process after process. Anytime there's a problem, they build more process.
Throwing billions of dollars at the military won't do much if there's no effective way to get projects completed quickly. Another thing military watchers will be watching for, how much of the financial commitments are up front and how much will be years in the making. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
We will have live coverage of the federal budget this Thursday, starting at 4 o'clock Eastern on Global TV and online at globalnews.ca. The federal government has introduced a bill that would make big tech companies like Google and Meta share their revenue with Canadian media outlets. Bill C-18 creates a process for online platforms to negotiate privately with professional media outlets. The Heritage Minister says Canada's news sector is in crisis. There's a rise in fake news, and tech giants are profiting from news content without having to pay to produce it.
We want to make sure that news outlets and journalists receive fair compensation for their work. We want to make sure that local independent news thrives in our country.
If the bill becomes law, digital platforms that don't comply with the new rules could face fines of up to $15 million. The 6th wave and a 4th dose coming up. The new guidance for a second booster shot for Canadians. It's been over 2 years since activity in most Canadian cities came to an almost complete halt. Public health restrictions kept many people at home. That's not a distant memory for people in China. There is a surge of COVID-19 cases there. 23 cities are in total or partial lockdown, including Shanghai. Mike Drolet reports on China's zero COVID strategy.
Shanghai, considered the heart of China's financial sector, rarely stops beating. Yet the streets are eerily quiet. 26 million residents are stuck at home, waiting for updates from the robot dogs now being used to share public health information.
Yeah, it's a very strict lockdown. In fact, I've seen people calling it one of the strictest lockdowns in the world. We're not allowed to leave home at all. All public transport has been cancelled. You're not even allowed to leave the front door.
China has frequently implemented strict lockdowns to control the spread of COVID-19. There are currently 23 cities under full or partial lockdown as China continues to strive to completely eradicate the virus, an all-encompassing strategy known as COVID-0, one New Zealand gave up on last fall. Epidemiologists now argue vaccines and mask mandates are more effective.
I don't think at this point, in fact at any point, long-term lockdown is really the answer to responding to COVID-19.
Chinese officials, however, say they are unwavering in their goal. A small army of health officials was brought in to test nearly all Shanghai residents. And while over 20,000 asymptomatic cases were caught, symptomatic cases numbered under 700.
People, I don't think, are worried in China and in Shanghai about the COVID itself. They're more worried, I think, about catching it because of the hassle that it will cause because, of course, in China, anyone who tests positive needs to go into central quarantine.
The strain of the lockdown is starting to show, with a rise in social media complaints. putting into question how long the current strategy is sustainable. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
There is new guidance on COVID-19 vaccines in this country. The National Advisory Committee on Immunization is recommending the rapid deployment of second booster shots for people aged 80 and over and for residents of long-term care homes. Health authorities can also consider giving the additional booster for people between the ages of 70 and 79. The fourth shot should be given 6 months after the previous dose. Until now, a fourth dose was only recommended for immunocompromised people.
We are going to be offering a spring booster for elders and seniors in British Columbia as the people being most at risk.
BC is already set to roll out second boosters for people 70 and older, Indigenous people over the age of 55, and those who are immunocompromised. Only about half of the people in that province have received their first booster shot. And masks remain one of the most effective ways to prevent virus transmission. Many provinces, though, have already lifted their mask mandates. 2 are now extending those mandates. Quebec is extending its mask mandate for indoor public spaces until the end of the month, as that province deals with an uptick in new infections and hospitalizations. And masks will still be worn in PEI until April 28th, though the provincial state of emergency there will end at midnight and capacity limits will be lifted. Like oil and water ahead, how Canada's climate goals clash with new global energy demands.
You're watching Global National.
This week's report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was clear. The world is running out of time and options. At the same time, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has countries looking for other sources of oil and gas. That's prompted the Canadian government to challenge the energy sector here. Can you ramp up production and scale back greenhouse gas emissions? As Heather Urix-West explains, it's put the industry and its investors in a delicate spot.
The world needs oil, and Canada has it. But when it comes to energy, things are never so simple.
It's certainly a time of a lot of turbulence. Obviously, you have these very short-term impacts with the war in Ukraine.
The Wall Street Journal is reporting the White House wants more Canadian oil coming into the U.S., but only by rail or existing pipelines. Keystone XL remains off the table because while the world needs more energy, it also needs global emissions cut, and fast.
We must work with industry and provinces, and we must cap and reduce emissions from the oil and gas sector. The IPCC makes very clear that the oil and gas sector cannot do business as usual.
Last week, the federal government announced a plan to curb Canadian oil and gas industry emissions by 42% by 2030, something Alberta's premier calls impossible.
Explicit is a reduction in oil and gas production, which would just shift energy production from Canada to places like Putin's Russia and the OPEC dictatorships. This policy it's nuts.
But the industry itself, which has already committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050, sees the writing on the wall.
We need to work with our federal government to ensure that we can get our emissions to be in a place where they're comfortable. But at the same time, we need to meet our world responsibilities, which is to produce responsibly produced energy and sell it worldwide.
With a growth focus on renewables and exporting more liquefied natural gas.
The things we could do is replace Asian coal, European coal with LNG. But that would increase our emissions, but yet it would reduce global emissions. That's well recognized.
Ultimately, the world will need to transition away from fossil fuels, our reliance right now proving to be just too much of a threat. Heather Urix-West, Global News, Calgary.
Better late than never. Next, the extremely valuable notebooks mysteriously returned to a library. The complexity and diversity of life on Earth was not properly understood until a man named Charles Darwin started studying nature in great detail and taking notes. His trip nearly 200 years ago to the Galapagos Islands helped shape his theory of natural selection. So when 2 of his treasured notepads were stolen more than 20 years ago, it was devastating. Now, as Eric Sorensen reports, they've reappeared as mysteriously as they vanished.
They are the notebooks of Charles Darwin, invaluable, irreplaceable. Housed at the University of Cambridge, Darwin's notes were the starting point for the theory of evolution.
These are the notebooks in which that theory was put together. They're some of the most remarkable documents in the whole history of science.
But 20 years ago, the notebooks vanished from the shelves, apparently stolen. There were no cameras in these aisles then or now. So when this gift bag was dropped off last month, there, wrapped in plastic, Darwin's notebooks, with the message, "Librarian, Happy Easter, X."
I was shaking. You can hear that in my voice, and I felt joyful.
The notes were written in the 1830s, when Darwin sailed to the Galapagos. From island to island, he saw differences in tortoises and birds. A biologist, he developed a theory of natural selection, in which species compete and gradually evolve. Years later, he published On the Origin of the Species. But newspapers mocked the notion that the pedigree of man could be traced to apes. The religious community fought it for decades. In 1920s Tennessee, John Scopes was found guilty for teaching evolution, the basis for a later Hollywood film.
On page 10 of The Origin of the Species, Darwin states,
"I object to this, Your Honor."
But Darwin's theory became the foundation of modern thinking around human development and evolution of species. His treasured notes, including A Tree of Life, are among the world's foremost scientific documents.
The theory of natural selection and evolution is probably the single most important theory in the life and earth environmental sciences.
It is a mystery. They're in good condition.
The eroded copper clasps confirmed for researchers the notebooks are indeed Darwin's originals.
They've clearly been looked after with care wherever they have been, and the important thing is that they have ended up back here.
But who took them, who brought them back, and why? The investigation, it seems, is still evolving. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is a bird's eye view of St. Anthony, Newfoundland and Labrador. We'd love to see Your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.